You know, in the centre of almost every town in Australia there's one of these, a marble column, list of names. It tells a story. If you were here in 1914, at the end of 1914, you might have seen some of these boys that are listed here coming into town. Shearers, stockmen, drovers, farmhands, and going over to the station here. Maybe the band was playing, people were cheering, and they went off to fight the war. Not really knowing what it was about, but knowing they wanted to prove themselves somehow as men, and particularly to prove themselves as good members of the British Empire. Now, one of the untold stories that goes with that is that amongst those men, perhaps even from here, came some clergymen. A lot of clergymen volunteered to go with the army. Now, it seemed like a good idea, but nobody really knew how to prepare a padre for war. And you can picture some of these clergymen who had nice polite congregations, perhaps a university education, maybe from England, and they arrive in an army camp down in Sydney or Melbourne with a whole lot of men and who weren't used to going to church. Most of these boys would probably lived out on the farms or drove across the outback, or shearers that ride tinner and up and down the country. And the idea of having a clergyman amongst them must have been very novel. And particularly when they were preparing to be fighting men, and here's a bloke who's a non-combatant, what is he going to do? Well, the chaplains weren't really sure, and neither were the men, neither was the army. So basically they had to work it out for themselves. On the troop ships on the way over, some of the padres mentioned how awkward they felt and sort of a bit shocked by the language and sort of rough language of the men. But bit by bit, a good thing began to happen. The men began to understand the padres, and the padres began to understand the men, and they began to organise activities for them to keep them entertained on the ship, maybe sing songs or games or boxing matches or whatever. So when they arrived in Egypt, well, it was a bit of a different matter. I mean, they're in Cairo, there's brothels and bars, and they let these young Australians loose in the city. Well, it was a bit of a mess for a start. A lot of men were getting VD, and it was a bit of an embarrassment for the army because it was rendering them useless in a way. So the chaplains found themselves actually standing with the men to say to the army, you need to do better than this, you need to provide other things for the men to do than that. There's a famous story of one of the big husky Salvation Army chaplain called William Mackenzie from Queensland. He was a sugarcane farmer, 40 years old, tough man. And he gets in amongst the men, and he'd shown them he could out march them. He went on the marches with them. He could out dig a trench with them. He could shoot pretty well, and he was a very good boxer. He had a good uppercut. Well, they began to respect him, and so he got stuck in one night, and he went in and went through the brothels, pulled all the Australian soldiers out, and said, you know, show a bit of respect for yourself, for your wives, mothers, sisters. You know, try to live up to being your best selves. Well, that was an extraordinary thing, but when they actually hit the beaches at Gallipoli, that's when the chaplains began to actually become part of the Anzac myth. They weren't sort of an add-on, they were a very, very important part, because once they hit the beaches, once they got up the hill there at Gallipoli, men were dying. The chaplains found themselves in the front line quite often, or even beyond the front line in no man's land. 2 of them at least were shot dead trying to bring a wounded man back at the Battle of Lone Pine, and at that same battle, William Mackenzie, who got known as Fighting Mackenzie, said to them, look men, I can't just preach to you, I've got to go over the top with you as well. So he went out into no man's land carrying a shovel, and but those padres had the awful job of dragging back wounded men who were sort of shattered, carrying them, stretcher bearing, going to the hospital, helping out the very minimal medical staff that were there, writing the letters home to tell families their sons and fathers and husbands had died. One bloke reckoned he wrote and edited 10,000 letters. So you can see them serving this huge number of men there on Gallipoli, and being in the thick of it, being in the worst part of it, doing the burials for men even under gunfire. And bit by bit the chaplains began recognised by the hierarchy, and the senior officers are saying what a great job they were doing, working quietly amongst the men. And the men themselves began to respect these men they called Fighting Mackenzie, for example. So when he walked down the hill on a Sunday singing a hymn at Gallipoli, and you don't see pictures of this very often, all across the hill men began to sing the hymn with him and trickled down the hill out of their trenches and foxholes to join him for the service down in Shrapnel Valley. So when the chaplains came home, they weren't sort of on the edge of things, they'd been right in the thick of it. So when Fighting Mackenzie got home, for example, he was probably the best known Anzac. So they say when he got off the train in Town Hall and tried to get down to his office a couple of blocks away, it took him a long, long time because everybody wanted to shake his hand, everybody wanted to know him, which is a sort of a story you don't hear very often about, you know, preachers becoming sort of heroes in the Anzac tradition, but they were. The other side of that, of course, was that many of those chaplains came home with PTSD. Fighting Mac certainly did, and because they'd seen terrible things, their hearts broke. They got to love these men, you know, and they saw them dying, they saw their bodies emaciated, they had to bury them and then ride home to their families. So I like to think this is a story that needs telling, you know, that it's a part of the Anzac tradition, it's part of this story here, that these 50 men that went from just this little town of Narromine, some of them 2 men from the same family, but 6 families lost 2 from the same family, the sheer tragedy of it. And many of those chaplains came home, they weren't waving the flag and blowing the trumpet saying, yeah, war's a great thing. On the contrary, they were saying, this should never happen again, this is a terrible thing. And even these words on the gate here, lest we forget, it's a good reminder. When Rudyard Kipling, the British poet, wrote those words, it was before the war, and he was writing a poem saying to the leaders of the British Empire, don't forget, God has given you a responsibility for all the people in the Empire. Don't forget it. He will hold you accountable. Well, that's the part the chaplains played. They were saying there's a bigger picture than just men fighting men and empires fighting empires. Every man mattered. Everybody had a significance, and that was their role, giving as individual Anzacs. So even these men here, you can guarantee that there were chaplains from the army burying these men, riding home to their families, and showing love and compassion and living out what Jesus had said, greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends, and the chaplains were part of that.